beneath the silence of archives and the dust of forgotten battlefields, there lies a shadowed history, a second war fought in whispers and sealed vaults. The maps we know end at the ruins, yet beyond those burned edges linger corridors of secrecy where files were never meant to be opened and truths never meant to be spoken. Imagine doors marked with warnings, their locks untouched for decades, each containing fragments of stories erased by design. These are not tales of armies marching across open ground, but of coded messages slipped through the night, of experiments hidden under false names, and of machines abandoned in forests where no one was supposed to find them. It is here, in this twilight between victory and silence, that the most unsettling discoveries remain buried. Once glimpsed, they cannot be unseen, like a ghostly echo of a war that never truly ended, only retreated into the dark. Chapter 1: The Vanished Convoy of Operation Caesar. In the final months of the Second World War, when the Reich was visibly collapsing under the combined weight of Allied and Soviet advances, a last, desperate operation was set into motion by the Kriegsmarine. It bore the codename Operation Caesar. The mission centered around U-864, a Type 9D2 long-range submarine designed to carry both men and material across vast distances. She was dispatched in December 1944 from Kiel, with instructions to proceed to occupied Norway before embarking on a voyage that was intended to link Germany to its Axis partner, Imperial Japan. What she carried would later become the source of decades of speculation. 4 German engineers, advanced parts for jet engines, drawings for V2 guidance systems, and nearly 67 tons of liquid mercury sealed in steel flasks. The mercury was critical to Japanese weapons research, specifically for the production of detonators and chemical munitions. At the time, Allied intelligence had intercepted fragments of the mission through Enigma decrypts, yet the full scope of Operation Caesar remained obscured. In February 1945, the British submarine HMS Venturer, commanded by Lieutenant James Launders, intercepted U-864 off Fedje, near Bergen, Norway. What happened next was unprecedented. Launders tracked the U-boat for several hours and executed the only recorded instance in naval history of one submarine sinking another while both were submerged. 4 torpedoes were fired, 2 found their target, and U-864 was sent to the bottom with all hands. The Admiralty congratulated Launders, and the case was considered closed, but discrepancies began to appear almost immediately. Intercepts had suggested 2 vessels were dispatched under the Caesar designation, yet only one was ever officially recorded. A small batch of cables sent between the Admiralty and the Secret Intelligence Service in March 1945 were classified most secret and restricted from the usual operational files. These cables, declassified only in 1973, contain a peculiar reference to additional cargo, diverted, unconfirmed. Norwegian fishermen in the late 1940s began to report odd shapes on their sonar near Fedje. Bank divers who went down in 1950 described a wreck split open, with metallic containers scattered across the seabed. Their testimonies were quietly collected by the Norwegian Navy and sealed. One diver, Eric Strand, later recalled in a private interview in 1972 that several containers bore signs of violent rupture, as if they had been cut open before sinking. His remarks were dismissed, yet NATO patrols continued to pass over the same coordinates well into the 1980s, deploying sonar sweeps and occasionally deterring civilian vessels from approaching. Why would a single wreck from 1945 remain under such scrutiny? By the 1990s, environmental concerns surrounding mercury leakage from U-864 forced the Norwegian government to commission detailed surveys of the wreck. Remotely operated vehicles confirmed the submarine lay in 2 large sections, 150 meters below the surface. Containers of mercury were visible, many corroded. But what puzzled the survey team were other scattered remains. Large steel cylinders, inconsistent with standard cargo containers, and several fragments of instrumentation not listed in the German Naval Manifest. Photographs of these objects were never made public. In a confidential exchange between the Norwegian Coastal Administration and NATO Naval Command in 2003, the term sensitive materials of unknown classification was used to describe them. Historians attempting to trace the cargo faced a wall of missing documents. Kriegsmarine logs for December 1944 to March 1945 are incomplete. Intercept records from Bletchley Park mentioning Caesar II are fragmentary, redacted heavily in surviving files. Declassified US Navy documents include references to 2 subs in Caesar traffic, yet the second is never identified. The working theory among some military researchers is that a companion submarine carried advanced navigation prototypes, possibly gyroscopic or radio guidance systems, intended for Japanese adaptation into long-range missiles. The United States, in the early Cold War, made significant advances in missile guidance, advances that appeared suspiciously abrupt when compared to their wartime trajectory. Further complicating the case are reports from German POW interrogations at Camp 020 in the United Kingdom. Transcripts dated June 1945 describe officers mentioning a twin mission to Japan involving special apparatus meant to blind enemy radar. These transcripts were archived under the War Office file designation WO208, but several pages are missing from the original bundle. Researchers granted access in the 1980s found blank inserts labeled "removed for security" reasons. The fact that such removals occurred decades after the war suggests the information remained sensitive when NATO decided in the early 2000s to either entomb or salvage the wreck due to environmental risk. Debates erupted within military and intelligence circles. Some argued that salvaging might expose classified remnants long kept hidden, not only to the public but also to foreign powers. China and Russia expressed interest in monitoring the operations at Fedje, citing environmental safety, though analysts believe their attention was drawn to the possibility of recovered technology. In 2017, a decision was reached to cover the wreck with a giant sarcophagus of sand and rock, effectively sealing its remains for generations. Officially, this was to contain the mercury threat. Unofficially, it meant no one would again probe the suspicious containers lying among the wreckage. If indeed a second submarine existed, and if its cargo or personnel were intercepted, there is no clear trace of its fate. Some American intelligence reports suggest that parts of Caesar's mission may have reached Allied hands, feeding into early post-war research projects. The sudden post-war leap in radar jamming and missile guidance systems by both the US and the Soviet Union may not have been mere coincidence. In that context, the mystery of the vanished convoy becomes not a matter of missing German files, but one of deliberate suppression. To admit the existence of Caesar's twin vessel would be to admit that advanced Axis technology had been appropriated and concealed during the fragile years of post-war geopolitics. Even today, naval records remain opaque. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act, directed at the British Admiralty and the US Navy, produce the same response. No additional material located. Norwegian authorities maintain that only one wreck exists at Fedje. And yet, the unease lingers. Why did Allied intelligence describe Caesar in the plural? Why were patrols maintained for decades after the wreck was supposedly charted and settled? Why do surviving technical reports on German submarine cargoes in 1945 contain blank spaces exactly where Caesar is mentioned? The bottom of the North Sea holds its secrets tightly. U-864 lies broken, her mercury leaking slowly into the dark waters. What lies scattered beyond her steel bones remains unknown, guarded by time, politics, and the silence of archives. The vanished convoy of Operation Caesar is less a single submarine story than a puzzle piece in a wider mosaic of suppressed history. And as long as the classified files remain locked, the truth of what Germany attempted to deliver to Japan, and what the Allies may have quietly taken for themselves, will remain hidden in shadows that stretch far beyond 1945. Chapter 2: The Forgotten Fires of Dresden's Vault. On the night of 13th of February 1945, more than 700 British bombers roared over the Saxon capital of Dresden. The resulting firestorm consumed tens of thousands of civilians and destroyed one of Europe's most historic cities. What has been less often acknowledged is what lay beneath the flames. Dresden was not merely a cultural hub. In its basements, tunnels, and government vaults, the Third Reich had stored sensitive intelligence material, intercepted Soviet codebooks, and archives related to its espionage networks across occupied Europe. Allied planners knew Dresden housed command posts of the Reichspost and communication relay stations. Yet the precision and timing of the raid, coupled with what vanished afterward, points to an ulterior motive: the deliberate destruction of a hidden intelligence archive codenamed Operation Nibelung. Survivor accounts from Dresden speak of a heavily reinforced underground vault beneath the Altmarkt district. One man, a railway clerk named Hans Friedrich, described to Soviet investigators in March 1945 how soldiers evacuated crates into a tunnel system days before the raids. The containers, he claimed, were marked with Reichspost insignia but escorted by SS men. He reported hearing the words Nibelung and signal traffic before the soldiers sealed the tunnel entrances. When Soviet forces finally entered Dresden, much of the above-ground city was rubble, but engineers were directed to blast their way into sealed vaults beneath the city center. Reports sent back to Moscow, classified until the 1960s, describe metallic canisters, microfilm reels, and cipher tables. These reports are no longer accessible. In their place are brief notations claiming artworks and cultural archives were recovered. There is little question that Dresden was significant in the Reich's intelligence architecture. By late 1944, German signals units were shifting communications hubs away from Berlin, which had become vulnerable to Allied bombing. Dresden's central rail and telegraph connections made it an ideal fallback site. British and American intelligence knew of these movements through Enigma decrypts, yet the details of what was actually in Dresden remain maddeningly vague. RAF mission briefings from early February mention priority destruction of underground relay facilities, a phrase not used in relation to other German cities. Was the city chosen for annihilation to deny the Soviets access to these files? The Soviet record is equally troubling. In December 1946, the Khabarovsk Military Tribunal introduced, almost in passing, a Soviet officer's memorandum describing signal intelligence documents captured in Dresden. These included Allied operational timetables from 1943, evidence of deep German penetration into resistance networks, and partial decrypts of Soviet cipher traffic. But the memorandum abruptly cuts off, replaced by testimony concerning Japanese biological warfare. The Dresden reference was never elaborated on. By the time East German authorities revisited the Altmark vaults in the 1960s, they found little more than collapsed tunnels. Witnesses, however, claim the Stasi removed boxes under heavy guard before sealing the area. British archives add another layer. In 1978, researchers combing through Air Ministry files found a set of missing sortie maps from the Dresden raids. In their place were inserts marked "transferred to SIS custody." No explanation was given. The fact that intelligence service custodians, not the Air Ministry, held onto these maps suggests that Dresden's targeting was linked not purely to strategic bombing, but to covert objectives. By erasing records of the vaults, both sides avoided accountability for what might have been seized. Testimonies from German civilians have long circulated in Dresden, passed down in whispers. Some claimed they saw trucks marked with Red Army symbols leaving the city loaded with crates, escorted by soldiers carrying documents rather than weapons. Others recalled Allied aircraft photographing the ruins days after the bombing, long after the city posed no military threat. The unusual post-strike reconnaissance suggests the Allies wanted confirmation that certain targets had been fully destroyed. In the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, hopes rose that Russian archives might reveal the truth. Yet requests for the so-called Nibelung files were met with silence. German historians who pressed Moscow for access were told that no such designation existed. However, in 1995, fragments of microfilm reels surfaced at a flea market in Prague, apparently originating from a Stasi clearance operation. The reels contained partial transcripts of Allied radio traffic from 1943, annotated in German. Their authenticity was never conclusively proven, but their content aligned with what Soviet investigators had once alluded to: the possibility that Dresden's destruction served dual purposes, both military terror bombing and the cover-up of espionage. Evidence remains controversial. The RAF insisted the raid was meant to disrupt German troop movements to the Eastern Front, yet operational documents repeatedly reference signal centers and relay hubs, terms which carry little meaning in the context of troop deployment but immense significance in the realm of communications intelligence. For the Soviets, any evidence of German penetration into their cipher systems would have been catastrophic, undermining their wartime narratives. For the British and Americans, the discovery that German agents had possibly infiltrated Allied commands could have sparked political scandal. By the 2000s, interest in Dresden's secret vaults revived as urban archaeologists began mapping the city's underground. Some of the old Reichspost tunnels remain sealed, guarded under the guise of structural danger. Officially, they pose collapse risks. Unofficially, there are whispers that fragments of the Nibelung archive may still lie buried, waiting to be unearthed. The forgotten fires of Dresden are remembered for their human toll and cultural devastation, but hidden within the ash lies an unresolved intelligence mystery. Did Allied commanders destroy Dresden, not simply to break German morale, but to eliminate an archive that threatened to expose espionage on both sides. Were Soviet engineers the first to plunder what was left, burying their findings in Moscow's closed vaults? And if so, what truths about Allied vulnerability, betrayal, or compromise still sit in files stamped "Do Not Release"? 75 years later, Dresden is rebuilt, its skyline restored. But beneath its streets, in tunnels sealed by war and secrecy, the unanswered questions of Operation Nibelung linger like smoke. For those who dig into the archives, the story is less about bombs and firestorms and more about what survived them, only to vanish into silence. Chapter 3. Project Paperclip's Shadow Unit X-17. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, American intelligence launched Operation Paperclip, the now infamous program that transferred German scientists to the United States under sanitized records. The public story focused on men like Werner von Braun and the rocket specialists of Peenemünde, who would go on to shape America's space program. Yet within the dense bureaucracy of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a set of memoranda from late 1946 refer to a parallel channel of recruitment never acknowledged officially. This channel was labeled Unit X-17. Unlike von Braun's team, whose presence was eventually celebrated, the names of X-17's specialists were never revealed. Their files are not listed among the Paperclip dossiers released in 1973. They appear only in redacted communications between the War Department and the newly formed National Security Agency, describing cryptologic and frequency research assets sourced from Peenemünde Süd facilities. By 1943, German engineers had been experimenting with what they termed Funksender, electronic jamming devices designed to blind British radar during bombing raids. Allied reports confirm that Luftwaffe night fighters benefited from limited jamming capability against the British chain home system, though the technology was not fully operational by war's end. What emerged in the declassified fragments, however, suggests that at Peenemünde there were prototypes of a far more ambitious nature. Frequency-modulated systems capable of masking entire formations of aircraft from radar detection. Whether these devices were tested operationally remains unknown, but their capture at war's end became a priority. In May 1945, a US Army Signal Intelligence Unit, the 44th Signal Battalion, filed an intelligence report from Nordhausen. Within it is a reference to materials concerning radio Wellen modulation evacuated to an American-controlled site. This phrase was underlined in the original typewritten document and later marked, "Refer to X-17." For decades, the notation had no meaning until a researcher in the 1980s discovered multiple documents carrying the same mysterious reference. All were connected to radio, radar, and electronic countermeasures. Unlike other Paperclip scientists, X-17 specialists were not given public contracts or university posts. Instead, they were dispersed into laboratories under US Air Force control. A 1952, memorandum from the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force. Base references: consultants formally designated X-17, working on microwave counter radar. Yet the names were removed before declassification. The secrecy surrounding their identities contrasts sharply with the openness about von Braun's team, suggesting their work touched areas of strategic vulnerability in the emerging Cold War. Testimonies from men who worked at Wright-Patterson during the 1950s offer glimpses into what X-17 may have developed. One engineer, interviewed in 1979, recalled projects involving phantom formations, radio transmissions designed to create false radar images of bomber fleets. Another remembered testing silent channels that allowed aircraft to communicate without detection by standard radio surveillance. These testimonies, though unverifiable, align with the abrupt advances in American electronic warfare capabilities in the 1950s. The secrecy extended beyond personnel. Freedom of Information Act requests filed in the 1990s for X-17 material consistently return heavily redacted files. Pages show only fragments. X-17 evaluations, Peenemünde frequency assets, NSA custody. Entire sections are blacked out with the phrase, "National security interest, do not release." The persistence of such redactions more than 70 years after the war suggests the subject remains operationally sensitive. German sources offer their own hints. At Peenemünde, captured scientists testified to Allied interrogators about a division working not on rockets, but on communications warfare. A report from Operation Dustbin, the British program to interrogate German scientists at Kranzberg Castle, mentions a frequency laboratory ensued, range not accessible during occupation. Several prisoners described colleagues who were removed by American officers before the Soviet zone takeover. None of these men appear in post-war German directories or records of repatriation. Their disappearance fits the pattern of X-17. Why did the United States conceal these individuals so thoroughly? One possibility is that their work crossed into offensive capabilities still classified. Radar jamming, decoy transmissions, and stealth techniques were critical in the nuclear bomber era. If the X-17 specialists had developed methods to render formations invisible or to project false signals, this knowledge would have been invaluable in the 1950s, when the United States relied on strategic bombers as its nuclear deterrent. Revealing that such capabilities originated from captured German work might have undermined American claims of technological supremacy. There is also evidence that Unit X-17 intersected with early NSA operations. A 1954 NSA memorandum, heavily censored, describes legacy X-17 personnel working on frequency-hopping communications. This technique, which allows radio signals to shift rapidly between frequencies to avoid detection or jamming, would later become fundamental to secure military communications. Yet in public histories, its American development is attributed to post-war research independent of German input. The classified references suggest otherwise. By the 1960s, the trail of X-17 grows faint. The scientists may have been naturalized, their past buried under new identities. Their research, meanwhile, fed into classified Air Force and NSA programs. What remains are scattered references, redacted documents, and the silence of agencies that refuse to acknowledge the unit's existence. Unlike von Braun, they were never paraded before Congress or celebrated on television. They remained shadows, their work hidden in the classified infrastructure of electronic warfare. The legacy of Project Paperclip is already fraught, but the story of X-17 deepens the unease. It raises the possibility that America not only imported Nazi rocket scientists, but also absorbed secret teams dedicated to electronic deception, their knowledge shaping the Cold War's invisible battlefield. The fact that such details remain concealed more than 7 decades later suggests that the technologies they pioneered are not relics of history, but living tools still embedded in military arsenals. Project Paperclip's Shadow Unit X-17 was never meant to be remembered. Its scientists vanished into the system, their names erased, their files locked. What survives are the faint imprints of their work, phantom signatures on radar, fragments in declassified files, and the lingering suspicion that the United States built part of its Cold War supremacy on secrets too sensitive to admit. Until the blacked-out pages are released, the truth of X-17 will remain hidden, an unfinished chapter in the long story of how the world's most brutal war bled into the silent confrontations of the decades that followed. Chapter 4: The Hidden Camps of Operation Lusty. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence raced not only to occupy territory, but to capture technology. The program codenamed Operation Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, was officially tasked with seizing advanced aircraft, blueprints and test data before they could be destroyed or claimed by the Soviets. The story of jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262 or the rocket-powered Me-163 is well known. What remains buried in fragments of testimony, sealed diaries and missing reports is evidence that Operation Lusty also uncovered hidden facilities in the Bavarian Alps where experimental prototypes and their engineers were quietly absorbed into clandestine research camps, controlled not by the Luftwaffe, but by their Allied successors. The first reference appears in an RAF officer's diary dated 8th of May 1945, the very day of Germany's surrender. Wing Commander Harold Lewis of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit wrote of a remote alpine strip near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, where odd airframes were parked under camouflage netting. He described fuselages unlike known Messerschmitt models, and noted that American intelligence officers instructed him not to record serial numbers. His entry was never published during his lifetime. Only after his death in 1989 did his family turn the diary over to researchers. The relevant pages were photocopied, then quickly restricted again by the Ministry of Defense. Survivor accounts from local Bavarian villagers add to the puzzle. Several residents recalled convoys of trucks moving through mountain roads in late April 1945, escorted by German soldiers but heading toward remote clearings rather than major towns. One farmer, interviewed by German journalists in the 1960s, claimed that after the war, He saw American engineers working with former Messerschmitt staff at a secluded site, guarded by MPs. He insisted test flights continued into 1946. Though no official records corroborate his story, the farmer's account was dismissed at the time as rumor. Yet his description of the aircraft, slim, long-nosed, with engines mounted not under but inside the fuselage, matches sketches of unbuilt German projects like the Messerschmitt P1101 and the Lippisch P13. Captured Luftwaffe files deepen the mystery. Many production and test records for late war prototypes abruptly end in March 1945. This sudden silence coincides with testimony that aircraft and personnel were evacuated southward into Bavaria. A 1946 US Army Air Forces report lists non-essential prototypes seized in the region, yet the details are suspiciously vague. Categories such as miscellaneous gliders and unserviceable fuselages are applied to items that clearly warranted interest. Why would elite intelligence teams bother with broken gliders? The use of dismissive labels suggests deliberate obfuscation. Operation Lusty was divided into two teams: the Air Documents Research Center, which collected written material, and the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, which seized equipment. Yet several seizures in Bavaria never appear in either archive. Instead, scattered memoranda reference special custody of materials unsuited to transfer. The phrase reappears in correspondence between US Army officers at Oberammergau and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, the site that would become infamous for storing captured German technology. One particularly telling document surfaced in 1975 when a retired US officer privately donated papers to a university archive. Among them was a list of German engineers detained for technical exploitation at an unspecified Bavarian site in June 1945. The names were partially obscured, but at least two belonged to men who later worked for American aerospace firms under altered records. Their presence in Bavaria contradicts official Paperclip transfers, which list them as arriving months later through other channels. The Cold War context explains the secrecy. By 1946, the United States and the Soviet Union were competing fiercely for control of German scientific expertise. If hidden camps existed where prototypes were tested in violation of Allied agreements, exposure would have jeopardized diplomatic leverage. Officially, German aircraft research ended in May 1945. In reality, fragments of it appear to have lived on, quietly integrated into American experimental programs. The X-plane series of the late 1940s, including the Bell X-5, bears striking similarities to German projects that supposedly never left the drawing board. The question of where the missing prototypes went remains unanswered. Some researchers believe they were dismantled and shipped to the United States. Others argue they were tested in situ, in hidden Bavarian clearings before being destroyed. Eyewitnesses recall hearing engines in the mountains months after the war had ended. A declassified US Army intelligence map from August 1945 even marks restricted flight area over Garmisch-Partenkirchen, though no American units officially flew there at the time. By the 1950s, the traces vanish entirely. Engineers who might have been involved either disappeared into Paperclip's sanitized rosters or returned to civilian life in West Germany under silence agreements. The aircraft themselves were either scrapped or concealed under other project names. The Lusty archive, supposedly exhaustive, contains no references to these Bavarian operations. The RAF diary, the villagers' testimony, and the scattered memoranda remain the only clues. If these hidden camps existed, they illustrate how the boundary between World War II and the Cold War was porous. The Allies were not simply seizing German technology, they were continuing it under new management, erasing the origins to avoid accountability. The Luftwaffe's most advanced ideas may have been tested not in Berlin or Augsburg, but in Alpine clearings, guarded by Allied troops and shielded from public record. Today, the forests near Garmisch-Partenkirchen are quiet. Hiking trails wind through valleys once patrolled by convoys, but beneath the soil, reinforced concrete foundations can still be found, their purpose unexplained. To locals, they are relics of war. To historians who connect the fragments, they may be the last physical remains of Operation Lusty's hidden camps, places where the future of aviation was tested in secrecy under the shadow of surrender. Chapter 5: The Erased Atrocities of Unit 731 Exchanges. Among the darkest secrets of the Second World War lies the story of Unit 731, the Japanese Biological Warfare Division stationed in Harbin, Manchuria. Official histories record its human experiments, frostbite tests, plague-infested fleas, vivisections performed on prisoners. What is less acknowledged is how its legacy was bartered between the emerging superpowers at war's end. In 1947, under the cover of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731's leadership in exchange for their research data. But Soviet records from the Khabarovsk Tribunal the previous year tell a parallel story of similar exchanges conducted with Moscow. Between these two powers, the atrocities of Unit 731 were not prosecuted, but partitioned, divided into classified Cold War assets. The fragments of this story begin with intercepted communications in August 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender. Soviet intelligence reported Japanese medical convoys fleeing Harbin, carrying crates marked with biohazard symbols. American officers in China noted similar evacuations. By the time Soviet troops occupied the city, laboratories had been stripped. Witnesses described airlifts of sealed containers departing under American guard from airstrips near Mukden. The Soviets, however, presented their own evidence. Depositions from captured Japanese officers describing the transfer of specimen containers across the border into Siberia. In both cases, the cargo was never publicly identified. The Khabarovsk Tribunal transcripts, declassified in part in the 1960s, detail testimony that Japanese scientists supplied plague, anthrax, and cholera data to Soviet interrogators. But one passage is consistently redacted. A statement by General Kawashima Kiyoshi, former head of Unit 731's divisions, who allegedly described parallel negotiations with American officers. The missing pages leave unanswered whether the same material was given twice to both adversaries, or whether separate batches of data were selectively provided. What is certain is that neither power sought full public disclosure. Instead, they accused each other of exploiting Unit 731 while concealing their own complicity. In the United States, this secrecy took form in CIA memoranda from 1948, now declassified but heavily censored. One file under the subject line, Exploitation of Japanese BW Data, mentions acquisition of Manchurian files and cultures via SCAP channels. SCAP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, was Douglas MacArthur's occupation authority. These memoranda confirm that Unit 731's leaders were shielded from prosecution in exchange for their cooperation. Yet other notes mention duplication of Soviet acquisitions, implying that Moscow too possessed fragments of the same data. The true cost of this bargain was borne by the victims, whose suffering was erased. Thousands perished in Harbin's logs experiments, so called because prisoners were dehumanized as maruta, or logs. Yet their existence was absent from post-war justice. When American prosecutors drew up the indictments for Tokyo, no mention of biological warfare appeared. Instead, the records of Unit 731 were classified, stamped for national security use. The Soviets, meanwhile, publicized parts of the Khabarovsk proceedings, but buried the most sensitive testimony. Each side wanted to preserve the scientific value without admitting to moral complicity. The aftermath bled into Cold War programs. In 1952, an outbreak of plague in North Korea was attributed by Chinese and Soviet officials to American biological warfare. Washington dismissed the claims as propaganda, but the accusations gained traction because of the known history of Unit 731 exchanges. Declassified Soviet memoranda from that period mention application of Japanese BW material to defensive programs, an ambiguous phrase suggesting dual use. American records are more explicit. A 1956 Army report references field trials using U-731 legacy data. The designation U-731 appears only in a handful of documents, but its meaning is unmistakable. Several American officers connected to the Unit 731 negotiations later died under ambiguous circumstances. Colonel Murray Sanders, sent to Japan in 1945 to interrogate the scientists, was central to the immunity deals. His death in 1950 was recorded as a heart attack at age 44. Though family members later raised doubts, another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Russell, who handled transport logistics in Manchuria, died in a 1953 plane crash under circumstances described in classified reports as undetermined. Whether these deaths were coincidental or the result of knowledge too dangerous to reveal remains an open question. For decades, families of Unit 731's victims in China demanded accountability. Their calls were met with silence, both from Tokyo and Washington. Documents that might have confirmed the extent of the American bargain remained sealed until the 1990s. when fragments finally emerged through Freedom of Information requests. Even then, pages describing specific cultures, plague, cholera, glanders, were withheld under national security exemptions. The Cold War may have ended, but the secrets of biological warfare remained shielded. Russian archives have fared no better. Requests by international scholars in the 2000s for full access to Khabarovsk tribunal files were denied. The few accessible pages reveal tantalizing details, references to duplicate film reels sent from Harbin, notes on joint custody of bacteriological samples, and one chilling line about live subjects transferred. What became of those subjects is unrecorded. The erasure of Unit 731's atrocities is not merely a historical footnote, but an indictment of post-war realpolitik. Both superpowers chose to exploit the science of cruelty rather than confront it. The victims were denied justice, their suffering bartered for data that fueled Cold War programs. Even today, the full record of what was taken from Harbin remains inaccessible, locked in vaults under Moscow and Washington. What lingers are the absences, the missing pages of Kawashima's testimony, the redacted paragraphs in CIA files, the unexplained deaths of officers who handled the exchanges. Each absence speaks louder than what survives, pointing to a truth too uncomfortable to admit, that the victors of World War II were willing to inherit not only the scientists of their defeated enemies, but also their crimes, provided the knowledge could serve the needs of the next war. The erased atrocities of Unit 731 exchanges are not forgotten by those who still search. Beneath the classified designations, the black ink of redactions, and the silence of governments, the story remains, a tale of science purchased with blood, hidden in plain sight within the architecture of the Cold War. Until the archives are opened fully, the victims of Harbin will remain voiceless, their suffering recorded not in memorials, but in secret files, stamped with the cold bureaucratic phrase, "National security interest, do not release." And so we are left with questions lingering like smoke after a fire, shapes half-formed in the shadows, records blackened and sealed, secrets whispered but never answered. The visible war ended with parades and treaties, yet in the hidden corridors of history, the conflict never ceased. It shifted into silence, where knowledge became more dangerous than weapons and memory itself was a battlefield. What remains today are fragments, pieces scattered like shards of broken glass, sharp enough to wound anyone who dares to gather them. Perhaps the truth was never destroyed, only locked away in vaults waiting to be unearthed. Or perhaps it was buried so deeply that uncovering it would blur the line between victor and villain. In the end, the greatest mystery is not what was done, but why so much was made to vanish, leaving us to stare into the void and wonder what shadows still lie beneath.